Callum Rourke and Arben Kodra had controlled their empires for years, but when their paths collided in the US, a silent war erupted, one that would destroy everything they thought untouchable. Please subscribe and share for daily new update of crime story, and watch till. The war did not begin with gunfire or police sirens. It started quietly, hidden behind shipping schedules, cargo margices and port authority paperwork. Along the eastern coastline of the United States, major ports had become the lifeline of global trade, and within that flow of containers and steel, crime found its perfect cover. A powerful network with roots in Liverpool had slowly embedded itself into these ports, using legal businesses as shields. By day, containers carried machinery, food, and textile. By night, some of those same containers moved drugs, illegal weapons, and untaxed cash across borders without raising suspicion. For years, the system worked flawlessly, creating an illusion of control and safety. What the Liverpool network failed to realize was that another force had already claimed parts of this territory. The Albanian Mafia had arrived earlier, quietly, without drawing attention. Instead of flooding the streets with violence, they invested in logistics, finance, and silent partnerships. Their members avoided flashy lifestyles and stayed invisible, blending into immigrant communities and small businesses. They controlled routes through patience, not fear. Each shipment they moved strengthened their grip, and each successful operation tightened their control over the same ports the Liverpool group now believed were unclaimed. The first signs of conflict were easy to ignore. A delayed shipment here, a missing container there. These problems were common in busy ports, and no alarms were raised. But soon the losses became too precise to be accidents. Entire consignments vanished without trace. Security logs showed nothing unusual. Cameras failed at the wrong moments. Customs officers reported clean paperwork with empty containers behind sealed doors. Someone was interfering with the flow, and it was being done by professionals. Inside the Liverpool network, these disruptions created tension. The leadership believed a local American gang was testing boundaries. Plans were made to tighten internal security, replace port contacts, and shift routes. At the same time, the Albanian Mafia noticed similar losses. Their analysts tracked the disappearances and realized the pattern was too organized to be random theft. The conclusion was simple and dangerous. A foreign group was invading their operation. Neither side knew the other by name yet, but both felt the pressure of an unseen enemy. This uncertainty made the situation volatile. Every move felt like a provocation. Every loss demanded a response. Instead of seeking information, both sides prepared for conflict. Money was redirected toward enforcement teams. Corrupt officials were bribed deeper into silence. Surveillance increased across warehouses and docks. By the time the truth became impossible to ignore, the atmosphere beneath the ports had changed completely. What once felt like controlled expansion now felt like a ticking device waiting to explode. Two powerful criminal empires were standing on the same ground, convinced they were alone, unaware that their silence was already the opening act of the deadliest gang war the American underworld had ever witnessed. Control on paper was easy, but control in reality depended on people who never appeared in records. The Liverpool network relied on careful coordination, and at the center of that system stood Callum Rourke. He was not loud, violent, or careless. His power came from organization and timing. Every shipment had layers of protection, from altered schedules to trusted intermediaries who never met each other. Callum believed that chaos attracted attention, so his operation was designed to look boring, predictable, and invisible. For years, this approach kept his group ahead of law enforcement and rivals alike. Across the same ports, the Albanian Mafia operated with a very different rhythm. Arben Kodra had built his empire slowly, learning from older European syndicates that survived by patience rather than force. He focused on financial control instead of street dominance. Through shell companies, freight brokers, and offshore accounts, his organization owned influence without appearing powerful. Arben trusted numbers more than people, believing that money left fewer fingerprints than loyalty. His men were trained to observe, not react. and to disappear at the first sign of risk. When losses increased, both leaders sensed something was wrong, but their interpretations differed. Callum believed his own system was being studied by outsiders. He ordered internal reviews, quietly removing anyone who seemed nervous or careless. Entire routes were temporarily shut down, costing millions, but protecting secrecy mattered more than profit. He expected the problem to solve itself once the weak links were removed. Instead, the losses continued, sharper and more targeted than before. Arben, meanwhile, saw the situation as an intelligence failure. He suspected betrayal but could not find it. His analysts traced data, cross-checking ports, schedules, and financial transfers. The evidence pointed toward interference by a group that understood port operations at an expert level. This was not a local street gang. This was a foreign organization with discipline and experience. The realization shifted Arben's strategy from observation to preparation. Both sides began reinforcing their presence in the United States without making noise. Trusted figures were flown in quietly. New shell companies appeared overnight. Port workers received better payments, and silence became more expensive. Surveillance expanded, not through cameras but through people watching people. Every delay, every unexpected inspection, every container opened, became a message waiting to be decoded. The dangerous part was that neither Callum nor Arben wanted open war. Violence attracted federal attention, and both men had survived long enough to respect that danger. Yet restraint created another problem. Without direct confrontation, misunderstandings multiplied. Each side misread the other's silence as confidence. Each new loss was taken as deliberate provocation rather than strategic testing. By the end of this phase, something had changed permanently. What began as business disruption had turned into personal suspicion. Both leaders now believed that coexistence was impossible. Even without naming each other, they had accepted the same conclusion. The American ports were no longer big enough for two invisible empires, and the next step would decide who remained hidden and who would be erased. The shift from silent competition to open damage happened suddenly, but its roots had been growing for weeks. One night, a large storage facility near the docks was consumed by fire. Official reports later described it as an electrical failure, but the speed and precision of the destruction told a different story. Entire sections burned while others remained untouched, as if someone knew exactly where to strike. Millions of dollars in cargo were reduced to ash within hours, and more importantly, critical records vanished along with the goods. The Liverpool network reacted first, not with emotion, but with calculation. The fire had destroyed a shipment that was meant to stabilize recent losses. Callum Rourke understood the message immediately. This was not theft, this was sabotage. Someone wanted to hurt confidence, not just profits. Internal meetings were stripped down to the bare minimum, and layers of separation were added overnight. Long-standing contacts were paused, and new routes were tested with smaller shipments, treated like bait to measure response. On the Albanian side, the reaction was colder but equally intense. Arben Kodra examined the damage through numbers rather than flames. He noticed that only specific goods were destroyed, items linked to future expansions rather than current operations. That detail confirmed his suspicion that the enemy understood long-term planning. To Arben, this was no longer an unknown rival. It was a strategic threat that needed containment before it became uncontrollable. As tension spread, the violence did not follow predictable patterns. Instead of shootouts or public displays, people began disappearing. A financial handler failed to report for work and was never seen again. A logistics coordinator vanished during a routine inspection. No bodies were found. No witnesses came forward. These absences were more frightening than visible violence because they left no trail to follow. Each disappearance sent a signal without revealing the sender. What neither side realized was that the conflict was being carefully shaped by false intelligence. Anonymous tips, altered shipping data, and forged financial alerts began circulating through trusted channels. Each group believed the information came from reliable internal sources. In reality, the data was planted by a shadow network that profited from instability. By redirecting suspicion and accelerating responses, this unseen force ensured that every move pushed the two empires closer to collapse. Law enforcement began sensing irregularities but lacked clarity. The incidents did not fit traditional crime patterns. There were no gang markings, no public threats, no obvious leaders. What they saw instead were financial anomalies, sudden bankruptcies, and unexplained labor changes at key ports. Investigators knew something organized was unfolding, yet every lead dissolved into legal complexity and jurisdictional confusion. By the time both criminal groups understood that the conflict had crossed a line, the damage was already deep. Trust within their own ranks began to erode. Every mistake felt intentional. Every delay felt like betrayal. The fire that destroyed the warehouse had done more than burn cargo. It had erased the last chance for restraint. From that moment on, survival replaced strategy, and the quiet war transformed into a calculated fight for dominance, one that no longer allowed retreat. As the conflict matured, it no longer revolved around missing cargo or damaged warehouses. The battlefield shifted into systems that were harder to see and far more dangerous to lose. Financial channels began collapsing without warning. Accounts that once moved millions smoothly were suddenly frozen. Shell companies dissolved overnight, leaving behind legal confusion and unpaid debts. Both criminal networks felt the pressure tightening, not from law enforcement alone, but from an enemy who understood how to cripple an organization from the inside. The Liverpool group was hit first by a series of silent blows. Trusted money routes failed during routine transfers, trapping large sums in legal limbo. Banks flagged transactions that had passed unnoticed for years. Insurance claims linked to port losses were rejected due to missing documentation that had existed only days earlier. Callum Rourke realized that someone had gained access to sensitive financial structures. This was no longer about territory. It was about exposure, and exposure meant collapse. At the same time, the Albanian Mafia faced a similar unraveling. Offshore accounts were questioned. Shipping brokers refused contracts without explanation. Long-standing business fronts suddenly received audits from different agencies at once. Arben Kodra recognized a pattern that disturbed him deeply. These disruptions were too synchronized to be coincidence. Someone was coordinating pressure from multiple angles, pushing both organizations into defensive position. The most dangerous development was the growing mistrust within each network. Financial officers were accused of mistakes they could not lessen. Logistics teams were isolated and interrogated indirectly through sudden demotions or forced relocations. Loyalty, once assumed, became a liability. People stopped sharing information freely, slowing decision-making at the worst possible moment. The efficiency that once defined both empires began to decay. Behind this chaos, the unseen third group tightened its grip. By feeding selective information to financial institutions, exploiting regulatory loopholes, and manipulating legal reporting systems, they transformed the conflict into a self-destructive spiral. Every reaction by one gang triggered consequences that harmed the other, creating the illusion of mutual attack. The truth remained hidden, protected by layers of anonymity and false documentation. Law enforcement pressure increased, but remained unfocused. Investigators noticed that criminal activity was declining on the surface, yet financial irregularities were increasing. It appeared as if two major organizations were suffocating themselves. This confusion delayed decisive action, giving the shadow manipulators more time to profit from seized assets, rerouted goods, and collapsed partnerships. By the end of this phase, both criminal leaders understood they were bleeding without seeing the blade. Resources meant for expansion were now used for damage control. Allies became suspects. Silence became dangerous. The war had reached a stage where survival depended not on strength, but on information. And in that moment, neither side realized that the most powerful player in the conflict had never been visible at all. The pressure forced both sides to abandon caution. and that decision changed the nature of the war. The Albanian Mafia moved first, choosing precision over chaos. Instead of visible attacks, they targeted control. Key shipping schedules were altered at the last moment. Containers arrived at the right ports on the wrong days. Insurance protections quietly vanished from high-value cargo. Entire supply chains slowed to a crawl, not because they were destroyed, but because they no longer trusted themselves to function. Arben Kodra believed that choking the system would force his enemy into mistakes. The Liverpool network felt the damage immediately. Profits dropped sharply, but worse than that was the uncertainty. Goods were moving, but no one knew where they would end up. Callum Rourke understood that patience was no longer an option. He chose a different response, one built on fear rather than silence. Distribution hubs linked to rival logistics firms were suddenly taken over. Independent operators were pushed out or absorbed. Control was established not through contracts but through reputation. The message was simple and brutal: resistance would cost more than cooperation. The contrast between strategies created instability across multiple cities. The Albanian Mafia's invisible pressure confused workers and partners, while the Liverpool group's aggressive expansion alarmed everyone watching from the outside. Smaller criminal groups panicked, unsure which side would survive. Some tried to remain neutral. Others chose sides based on short-term survival, unknowingly exposing themselves to future retaliation. Law enforcement began noticing unusual patterns. There were fewer street-level crimes, yet emergency economic measures were triggered in port districts. Businesses closed without explanation. Employment records shifted rapidly. Officials suspected corruption but could not pinpoint its source. Every investigation seemed to touch legitimate companies with clean paperwork and strong legal defenses. The war remained hidden, but its effects were becoming impossible to ignore. Inside both organizations, exhaustion replaced confidence. The Albanian Mafia struggled to maintain discipline as profits stalled. Long-term planning became difficult when short-term survival demanded constant adjustments. The Liverpool network faced a different problem. Rapid expansion stretched loyalty thin. New partners were less reliable, and enforcement teams acted independently, increasing the risk of exposure. What neither side understood was that the shadow group was now harvesting the results. As routes collapsed and businesses failed, assets were quietly purchased through intermediaries. Warehouses, transport licenses, and port contracts changed hands legally. The chaos created opportunity, and someone was collecting it piece by piece. By the time both Callum and Arben sensed that the conflict was no longer under their control, the damage had reached a critical level. The war they believed they were fighting against each other had transformed into something larger and more dangerous. It was no longer about dominance, it was about who would survive the collapse that was already in motion. The collapse accelerated when a single breach changed everything. Within the Liverpool network, a trusted operations coordinator began quietly shifting patterns. Shipments that once moved safely were rerouted. Backup storage sites were suddenly exposed. Financial buffers vanished at critical moments. At first, these failures looked like stress-related mistakes, the natural result of a system under pressure. Callum Rourke believed exhaustion had finally caught up with his people, and he responded by tightening control even further. At the same time, the Albanian Mafia experienced an unusual streak of perfect timing. Enforcement teams arrived at abandoned locations minutes after shipments had been moved. Authorities inspected offices that had already been cleared. Arben Kodra viewed this as proof that his enemy was leaking information under pressure. The success felt too easy, almost scripted, but desperation pushed caution aside. Each advantage was used immediately, without questioning its source. What neither leader realized was that the same individual was feeding both sides. The coordinator inside the Liverpool network had never been loyal. He had been placed years earlier by the hidden third group, trained to wait patiently for maximum impact. His role was not betrayal for revenge or money alone, but controlled destruction. Every piece of information he released was calculated to trigger the worst possible response from both empires. As the damage multiplied, suspicion inside the Liverpool organization turned inward. Long-standing members were sidelined, access was restricted, decision-making slowed to a dangerous pace. By isolating itself, the network lost the flexibility that once made it powerful. Meanwhile, the Albanian Mafia pushed forward aggressively, unaware that their apparent intelligence advantage was artificial. Each successful strike encouraged deeper commitment to a strategy built on false certainty. The turning point came when financial losses reached a level that could no longer be hidden. Emergency restructuring began on both sides. Assets were liquidated quickly. Operations were shut down without replacement plans. These sudden moves triggered alerts across regulatory systems. Patterns that had remained invisible for years began to surface. Federal agencies started connecting data points that previously seemed unrelated. The Shadow Group anticipated this response. Their agent disappeared at the exact moment suspicion peaked. Digital trails were erased. Paper records led nowhere. By the time both criminal leaders suspected manipulation, there was no one left to accuse. The damage, however, was permanent. Safe locations were compromised. Backup plans had been exposed. Trust, once broken, could not be restored. As law enforcement pressure intensified, both empires faced the same realization from opposite sides. The war had not weakened their enemy as intended. It had weakened themselves. The true opponent had already escaped, leaving behind two collapsing structures filled with fear and confusion. The final stage was approaching, not as a clash of gangs, but as a reckoning neither side had prepared for. By this stage, desperation replaced strategy on both sides. The Albanian Mafia attempted to pull its remaining strength inward, focusing on consolidation rather than expansion. Arben Kodra ordered a tightening of operations, reducing exposure by cutting off weaker branches and abandoning risky routes. The idea was to survive the storm, protect what remained, and rebuild once the pressure eased. However, contraction created its own dangers. Former partners, suddenly cut loose, became liabilities. Some sought protection elsewhere, while others quietly cooperated with authorities to save themselves. The Liverpool network reacted differently. Callum Rourke believed survival depended on one final push. Instead of retreating, he authorized rapid movements meant to secure dominance before complete collapse. New routes were activated without full testing. Replacement contacts were rushed into sensitive positions. Speed replaced caution. This gamble created brief moments of success, but it also produced mistakes that could no longer be contained. Law enforcement, now armed with years of fragmented data, finally saw the full shape of the conflict. Financial records, port activity logs, and corporate registrations began aligning into a single picture. What once appeared as unrelated irregularities now formed a pattern of coordinated criminal control. Task forces expanded quietly, avoiding public attention while mapping the remaining networks. Surveillance intensified, not on the streets, but in offices, shipping yards, and financial institutions. The pressure closed in unevenly. Smaller operators were taken first, removed without noise. Their absence weakened larger structures further, creating gaps in logistics and communication. Panic spread beneath the surface. Members who had once trusted the system began preparing exits. Assets were hidden hastily. Records were destroyed or altered too late to matter. The sense of inevitability became impossible to ignore. The Albanian Mafia made a critical move to protect its leadership, shifting resources away from operations and toward concealment. This decision saved individuals but sacrificed influence. Control over key routes slipped away, not to rivals, but to regulatory shutdowns and legal freezes. The organization that once thrived on patience now found itself trapped by it, unable to react fast enough to a rapidly closing net. The Liverpool network faced a harsher outcome. The aggressive push triggered multiple alarms at once. Financial spikes, rushed trushers, and sudden corporate changes drew attention from agencies that had been waiting for confirmation. Warrants followed quietly. Accounts were seized. Properties were locked down. The structure did not fall in a single moment, but it cracked everywhere at once. As both sides struggled to survive, the truth became clear in fragments. There had been no final victory waiting at the end of the war. The conflict had already been decided by forces neither group fully understood or controlled. What remained was damage control, escape, and the realization that the deadliest stage of the war was not fought with violence, but with exposure. When the dust settled, the war had left nothing unscathed. The Liverpool network had lost its grip on American ports, and the Albanian Mafia's operations were fractured beyond repair. Safe routes vanished, key personnel had disappeared or been arrested, and financial systems once relied upon were now under federal control. Both empires had underestimated the complexity of the conflict, and neither had seen the true opponent until it was too late. The shadow group that had orchestrated the chaos had vanished, leaving no trace behind, but its presence was felt in every collapsed shipment and every frozen account. The streets of port cities, once bustling with invisible criminal activity, returned to a deceptive calm. Regular commerce resumed, but the networks that had quietly controlled them for years were gone. Empty warehouses, abandoned offices, and dormant vehicles were scattered reminders of the war that no one had publicly witnessed. Survivors moved cautiously, understanding that every step could trigger investigation or retaliation. Fear replaced loyalty, and silence replaced trust. The underworld had learned that power was fragile, and that even the most organized empire could crumble from within. In the aftermath, law enforcement pieced together fragments of the conflict. Arrest records, financial audits, and surveillance footage began to reveal a complex network of alliances and betrayals. Analysts could identify patterns, but many questions remained unanswered. How had both gangs failed to detect the manipulation? Who had orchestrated the precise timing of attacks and financial collapses? The answers lay in a shadow network that had profited from chaos yet had left no trace. Investigators understood that they had witnessed something unprecedented, a war fought in silence, with damage inflicted through deception rather than bullets. The human cost was staggering. Members of both organizations faced imprisonment, exile, or disappearance. Families of operatives struggled with sudden financial and social collapse. Alliances that had lasted decades dissolved overnight. Those who survived were forced to reckon with a new reality. The world they had controlled for years was gone, and the lessons of the war would haunt them forever. Fear of exposure, betrayal, and loss replaced ambition, marking the end of an era for the American criminal underworld. Perhaps the most chilling aspect of the war was the absence of a clear victor. The Liverpool network had been weakened, the Albanian Mafia had retreated, and the shadow group remained invisible, leaving behind confusion and instability. Neither gang had gained anything lasting, instead both had been used, manipulated, and destroyed from within. The true lesson of the conflict was brutal in its simplicity. The most dangerous battles are the ones you cannot see, fought by enemies you cannot identify. In the end, the deadliest gang war in the United States left its mark not in headlines or public violence, but in the fractured structures of the criminal empires themselves. Control over ports, money, and influence had shifted without notice, leaving a void that would take years to fill. The American underworld had been reshaped forever, a warning to anyone who believed power was permanent. And in the shadows, the group that had orchestrated it all moved silently, proof that the most powerful war is the one fought in secret, where victory is measured not by conquest but by the destruction left behind.